So, David and Sue, tell us a little bit about The Terror, and what about it made you want to bring this story to AMC in a 10-part limited series? What about it spoke to you? What about it intrigued you? Why do this show?
Well, I think it's the sort of story you don't often get a chance to tell, actually, as screenwriters or television writers, where you have a group of characters who are, in and of themselves, interesting characters, but you put them in a kind of slow motion disaster. So you get a chance to unpack all of their attributes, all of their, all the facets of their personality as the pressure just mounts and mounts. And, it's also based on some pretty amazing real history. So I think, it allows an audience to sort of project themselves into the show, sort of asking, what would I have done in this situation? How must it have felt to be 1,000 miles from the nearest civilization, quote unquote civilization, with only the things you brought with you and your own wits to get you out? I mean, those questions are pretty fantastic to be able to ask in a 10-hour show like this.
And it's based on this book by Dan Simmons, and for Dave and I, it's such an we can't tell you how amazing it is to get source material that's as good as what Dan wrote. And when we read the book, when I read the book, you can't put it down, and it's just this complete journey. And what's amazing is it's a true history, as Dave was saying, but I had known nothing about it, and it felt like we were uncovering a jewel. So that was really special.
Well, so you mentioned the book. Tell us a little bit about some of the complications, some of the challenges that you faced in taking this book and adapting it into a 10-part series. I mean, where do you start with something like that?
Well, I think you start by putting the question of producibility aside for a minute. I mean, it's important in a show like this where you're going to want to embrace every last bit of scale and scope you can with the resources you have to make it. And not hamper yourself by second guessing what you can and can't do. I mean, neither Sue and I knew, the sort of the VFX world inside and out. So we didn't want to limit ourselves very much at first. So we built 10 hours of television that at the end, yeah, sure, we had to pull back a little bit, but not as much as we thought we might. So that was the first step, is just to not put shackles on too early.
And at some point you have to let the source material go. And what's been interesting is people have asked us, is this from the book or is this from the show? And at this point, I don't even know anymore. It's just become this really organic dialogue. And Dan's really, he's been amazing being godfather for us on this project and trusting us. But at some point, you just have to let the book go. Any adaptation, you have to let it go in order for the cinematic version to breathe.
Well, I mean, I guess the best you can really hope for is just to capture the essence of the book instead of, a page-by-page recreation of it.
Sure, I think, and people who have really sparked to these kind of great adaptations that are on television now. The Walking Dead's an adaptation, Game of Thrones is an adaptation. People don't want to always know what's coming. There's a great fun in anticipating a sort of an iconic moment or scene from a book, and it's fun to sort of deliver those sometimes as an audience expects, but it's also a lot of fun to deliver them in ways that are subversive somehow.
So, talk a little bit about, I guess, when you're in the room and you're planning out the season. Can you give us a little bit of insight into how you chart the spine of each episode and how it's going to play overall?
We took an interesting route in that we decided to talk through character arcs first before we knew how they would break out into episodes. And with a story like this, there are sort of posts along the road we had to keep in a certain order, but we didn't let that bother us too much at first. But when I think of the writer's room, I just think of hundreds and hundreds of magnet strips with sort of little handwriting on them as we figured out how to get every last character beat we could into a show that was going to need also set pieces and some fairly aggressive flying.
And it was really just lovely in the writer's room because we knew where we were going to end. Yeah. Our show is 10 episodes and that's it. We weren't burdened with that question of how do we keep this show going, because we knew where that end was going to lead us. It freed us a lot to just be able to play with our characters and talk about characters. In some way, plot was actually probably not the least interesting, but the least stressful thing for us. Whereas in most TV rooms, it's the opposite. The plotting is so just stressful because you feel like you have to keep on finding an engine to get a show going. We didn't have that.
Yeah, we knew we could do our 10 and not leave any gas in the tank. It gives you great momentum.
In terms of period, this takes place in about 1848, I think it is. what did you look to try to place yourself in that time and to make it as authentic as possible?
A lot. We did an amazing kind of research in that we tried to limit it to first-person documents or books that were written in the period and also about the period. We built our own dictionary of Victorian words and phrases that were sort of approved for the show, meaning that they were self-explanatory in context. They weren't overly fussy. They weren't overly silly or witty. You know what I mean? We wanted to get sort of wit in the show and fun in the show in other ways other than just kooky phrases, because the Victorian era has a lot of kooky phrases.
But it was interesting because we sort of had to become schizophrenic a little bit, right? So in one end, one part of our brain is trying to protect the period, trying to be as accurate and faithful as possible, like down to the buttons on the officers' coats, down to the ship's design. But then another part of our brain just had to say, we didn't want to live in that period world. We wanted to also feel modern. So, we were constantly using both sides of the brain, being like, period, modern, period, modern. It was fun.
Well, these characters, in real life, these people would have thought of themselves as completely modern and, sort of geared up with the best technology of the time. And, you want to capture that kind of, if you're going to have a show that's about hubris, that's a part of it, is a feeling that you couldn't be more modern than you are. I think that's sort of an ingredient in a way that you are ahead of your time somehow. And certainly these men were, and we wanted their psychologies to reflect that.
Right. I mean, you bring up the characters, and obviously human nature doesn't change that much from century to century. Our customs and our technologies, and certainly what we're doing right now will one day be antiquated, I'm sure. But like you said, does that help? Just, putting yourself in the minds of the characters and focusing on their arc, does that help with the period?
Well, sure. As you can, look at the headlines today. Certainly, it's a level of xenophobia and racism that's never left civilized culture. And yeah, it certainly helps to sort of imagine that the conflicts they're in will speak to an audience because an audience finds them familiar. That's the cornerstone of any kind of bridge you want to build between characters in a period show and a modern audience, is that their concerns are, even if they present themselves differently, they are at heart the same kinds of concerns.
And it's interesting, this is speculative historical fiction, right? So there's things that we know and things we don't know. But for a lot of the things that we don't know, we've got to go back to some of the Inuit testimony. So in terms of the two ships being found in real life, in terms of where a lot of the bodies were found, in terms of where the route that the men took, that comes from Inuit testimony. And, in terms of talking about how we can make that narrative as modern as possible, some of that Inuit testimony comes from very recently. And by incorporating that work into our period show tells you that the past and present are still in dialogue with one another.
Mm-hmm. There's also a horror element to this show. And what's really interesting is the way that you guys tease that out over the 10 episodes. Generally, you would think that you just throw that right in there at the very beginning, but it builds very naturally. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I think we both, neither one of us is particularly a fan of the kind of sort of jump scare horror that tends to be most of what you see. To us, it's like sometimes you'll go to a restaurant and you'll have a fantastic appetizer, and then you'll get a main course that isn't very interesting, and you'll think, I wish I could swap them out. What you're referring to as a tease, we think of as the sort of the meat of a lot of the kind of scares we wanted to build in the show, that they were about atmosphere, they were about anticipation, they were about missing information as opposed to visual disclosure of something. And so, we were just so happy to have a story that seemed to really benefit from that approach. Sue and I probably aren't the first people you should go to if you want to make kind of a sort of contemporary slasher movie. I just don't, it's not the sort of thing that we don't want to brutalize anyone, nor do we want to be brutalized ourselves. And although the show goes to some dark places, we never want to mistake being startled for genuinely being unnerved or scared. We much prefer the latter.
But we do think this show is scary.
Absolutely.
We do think this show is a horror show only because, but what we define differently is when the horror happens, as Dave was saying. And it was so much fun talking about both in the writer's room and on set with our actors. The most fun part of horror is right before the actual horror moment happens, right? It's the lead up. You always remember that walk down the hall. In Psycho, you always remember the walk up the stairs, right? And in Aliens, you always, that's we wanted to just really play into the iconic of that, and we think that's great horror.
And in a feature film, you would have to get to the top of the stairs pretty quickly, right, because you'd have an hour and a half to do it. We had 10, so we could stay on the stairs a lot longer, which was great.
Makes me even more interested to see your remakes of Suspiria and Pet Sematary that I know you've written.
Suspiria is a different animal.
Right. Going back to those characters, I wanted to ask you about the cast. Let's start off with Jared Harris. Talk a bit about what made him right for this part and what working with him was like.
Oh, so many things made him right for this part.
I mean, when you look at Jared's career already, what he's done already with, he's done, no two roles are alike. And we wanted, for someone like Crozier, we needed someone who's going to disappear into this character, but also feel like a leading man. And Jared has both qualities in abundance.
And we knew we had a trick up our sleeve in terms of the long kind of game of the season, which was we wanted an audience to believe that Ciarán Hinds, that John Franklin, was your protagonist. And that required an actor to play Crozier like Jared, who can kind of play defense for a bit and really embrace that because he understood the logic of the long game, sort of the longer arc of the show. And then when he steps into that role of protagonist in a surprising way, you really don't quite know what you're going to get next. And I think that's really, it requires a level of both commitment and a lack of self-consciousness, about sort of playing a role like that shifts polarities. And Jared was a joy to work with. He really, as a collaborator, is just the best.
He probably deserves producer credit on this show. I mean, in terms of being a steward creatively, and also just practically how the set runs, he was such a partner for us. He went beyond, I think, what I've never seen an actor go to the depths that he did to really protect the show. So we're really thankful.
And I mean, I guess there's very few people alive working right now who can kind of capture that, I don't want to say Errol Flynn-esque type thing, because it's not necessarily that type of show, but that kind of, old-timey sea captain kind of swagger thing that he's able to, you know what I mean? That kind of attitude sort of thing, if that makes any sense. Like he feels like somebody who was making movies back in the 1930s and 40s, but
Absolutely. But I think that also speaks to a kind of charisma that you don't see very much today. I think there's a lot of plastic charisma out there. Jared has real charisma, in the sense that you sense his soul, and you just want to see more. You want to watch him kind of unpack himself in a way.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Ciarán Hinds. He was the next person I wanted to ask you about. Talk a bit about what made him right for the role, and about the dynamic between these two men.
I mean, for that role, Franklin, knowing that we were going to kill him off so early, we needed someone almost bigger than life to fill those shoes. It's interesting because Franklin historically has been cast as sort of more in a negative light, and we wanted to rescue that character in some ways, to be able to show a character who is both flawed but human, whose decisions can be understood but perhaps judged. And Ciarán has that perfect balance of someone who is both likable but also fallible. What he brings to a role, he just brings such a 360 human element. He's amazing.
And I have to say, the effect he had on the cast and the crew, he is such a magnanimous, lovely man that we were really sad when he had to go, because people grieved, just people in the culture of the show we really missed him when he left. He's just that kind of wonderful person.
And it says something whenever people see the trailer, like, oh my God, that guy's in your show. I love everything he's in. I mean, people say that about Ciarán. They love everything Ciarán does.
I was sad to see him go as well. And then I wanted to ask you lastly about Tobias Menzies, who is another wonderful actor who's in the show. Talk a bit about working with him.
Oh, he's a maestro. He's tremendous, and also had a kind of an arc that required him to sort of keep his head across, almost all of the episodes, because he moves so far from being somebody that you feel really encouraged to dislike to somebody you really feel like has earned your trust and love. And Tobias is the perfect person to play that, because he really was able to approach that character without judgment of his own, embrace that character in the way that we needed an actor to inhabit, for many episodes, he's a construction. He's a sort of a fiction he's presenting the world. And it's hard to do that without the seam showing. I think Tobias's work in this show is fantastic.
So I think we do need to start the Tobias Menzies for the next James Bond here.
Yes.
Fantastic James Bond.
Yes.
Producers, if you're listening, Tobias should be the next James Bond because he has it.
Yeah. Memo to Barbara Broccoli.
Yes.
FYC for James Bond. The show does such a really good job of placing the audience in the elements, in the frozen tundra, and the cold and the ice and all that. How did you guys create that kind of setting on the budget and the time that you had to do it?
Well, bringing the company up to Spitzberg and living there for 6 months was really key. I'm just kidding. It was styrofoam in a soundstage in Hungary.
When we first started this project, when we first went into prep, it was many stressful days and nights trying to figure out how to create the Arctic in Budapest and Pag Island in Croatia. And what's amazing is, we say 5 years ago, this show could not have been made. This kind of visual effects did not exist in the television world. The technology's gone so good, but not only that, the talent has come, right? These are, people on our team do enormous features. They would never do television, but because television has become such a, now it's become a competitor of features, we get this amazing talent from VFX. And what no one tells you about VFX, or at least no one told us, was, how just detailed the work is. It takes, you're watching one frame like 1,000 times to get it right. And in some ways that really suited Dave's and my personality, that kind of very methodical, detailed. We actually really loved the visual effects part of the show.
And I have to say, we had ample resources to make the show we wanted to make. But to make the show you see, which I think is even better than the one we had hoped to make, is because a lot of people put a lot of extra love into the show. Our VFX team and that crew, they were incredible and went so far past even our expectations, because everyone really loved working on the show. We had a culture around the show that was full of really kind-hearted, generous people, and people who wanted to do their best work on the show. And it really, we just have a massive amount of gratitude to the extra distance everyone went to make us, to give us the show that we sort of have on the screen. It's amazing.
Well, it's impeccably produced and very well written as well. David and Sue, thank you so much, and congratulations on The Terror. I appreciate your time. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good